Good morning. When something as big as the coronavirus pandemic hits our societies, it has the force to twist and buckle everything else. Our economic future, but also our political future, from the shape of the United Kingdom to relations with our major trading partners as we leave the EU. The shadow of COVID-19. So far, it's been all about the economics. Today, we're going to turn towards Scotland, Brexit, and what's really happening with those vaccines. As the Scottish National Party engages in its online annual conference, I'll be talking to Scotland's First Minister and its leader, Nicola Sturgeon. How well has she really done during the pandemic? As Number 10 stages a climb down over the length of COVID restrictions, I'll be joined by the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Rabb, and by his opposite number, Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. With questions being raised about the Oxford vaccine, we're also joined by Professor Peter Openshaw, the government advisor and specialist in vaccine testing. Reviewing the news for us this morning, the BBC's Scotland editor Sarah Smith and Nancy Fielder, editor of the Sheffield Star. Before all of that, this morning's news headlines, read for us today by Chris Mason.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning. The Prime Minister is attempting to head off a rebellion by his own MPs over the new tougher tiers of coronavirus restrictions in England. In a letter to his MPs, Boris Johnson said measures could be eased for some areas next month and promised a second vote in the new year. Here's our political correspondent, Ian Watson.
It's a testing time for the Prime Minister. He's facing a rebellion from some of his own MPs when the Commons votes on his new three-tier restrictions in England on Tuesday. So last night he wrote to his Conservative colleagues with a new formula to try to shrink the size of the revolt. In his letter he promises that if MPs back him this week, he'll give them a new vote on the restrictions on January the 27th. If he loses that vote, then the restrictions will end on February the 3rd. And he says a review of restrictions next month means some areas could come out of Tier 3 on December the 19th, though that will still depend on the evidence. And the newly appointed Minister for Vaccines had this message for any Conservative MP thinking of rebelling.
If we work together, we can very quickly move from the tier system to coming down those tiers to Tier 2 and Tier 1 with the mass testing.
The Prime Minister is also offering a fortnightly review of the tiers. But has he done enough to win over the rebels? Well, one of them told the BBC he wasn't impressed.
We asked for a lot of information, and that letter doesn't contain that information. So unless we get it between now and Tuesday, then it doesn't change anything, I'm afraid.
Boris Johnson wants to avoid relying on Labour votes to get his restrictions through the Commons. They are asking for more help for the worst affected areas. The Prime Minister says he wants to squeeze the disease, but first he'll have to squeeze the rebellion in his own ranks. Ian Watson, BBC News.
The government has secured another 2 million doses of the coronavirus vaccine from the US, which proved 95% effective after trials. The UK now has 7 million jabs on order from the American company Moderna. If the vaccine is approved, doses could be delivered by the spring. The UK has called on the EU to bring fresh thinking to post-Brexit trade talks, which Downing Street says could end this week. The EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, has been in London this weekend for talks with his UK counterpart, but big differences remain over fair competition and fishing. The SNP has promised to expand free school meals to all primary pupils in Scotland if the party retains power in next year's elections. The Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, told the SNP's annual conference that free meals would be provided all year round. It could come into force in 2022, making Scotland the first nation in the UK to do so. The actor who played Darth Vader in the Star Wars trilogy has died at the age of 85. Dave Prowse passed away after a short illness. He'll be remembered for being the man behind the mask of one of film history's most iconic characters, but was also the face of the Green Cross Code campaign, which earned him an MBE. That's all for me. The next news here on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
Very many thanks, Chris. And now to the front pages as ever. as Boris Johnson comes under pressure, worrying evidence on the Mail on Sunday that he is subscribing to a dose of entirely resistible metaphor-itis. Prime Minister, let's not trip on last barbed wire, he says. I'm sure that's very good advice. The Sunday Telegraph, virus tears could end in 9 weeks, MPs are told. Andrew Marr's third law of journalism is put no weight whatever on that word could ever. Sunday Express, Prime Minister's promises to MPs over the virus rules, the same story again. And there's the Sunday Times. Johnson in retreat as Tory revolt over tears rocks number 10. Now, Sarah Smith, you've been watching politics for a long time. This is a classic case of backbenchers coming in the back door, Prime Minister changing his tone out the front door.
Absolutely, because we heard Michael Gove's message to his fellow MPs yesterday, and it's a very different tone that we're getting from the Prime Minister. And as you say, some of it is in very Boris Johnson kind of rhetoric. So if you look at a piece he has written himself in the Mail, here, let me give you some of his phrases. We are so nearly out of our captivity, we can see the sunlit upland pastures ahead. But if we try and jump the fence now, we'll tangle ourselves in the last barbed wire. He's trying to paint a much more optimistic picture of how quickly the vaccine could come in and how there would be an end to these restrictions, which his MPs are threatening to revolt over. He says the armies of science are coming to our aid with all the morale-boosting, bugle-blasting excitement of Wellington's Prussian allies. How's that for
so
a
it's
bit
Waterloo, Zulu, Little House on the Prairie and The Great Escape, all in one sentence.
Absolutely. And of course, it may all come down to Labour votes if he can't persuade enough of his Tory MPs to back him. So the papers are full of speculation about that. Keir Starmer will make a decision tomorrow as to which way he's going to ask his party to vote. But there are several Labour MPs coming out publicly saying they will not vote for these restrictions, whatever the party line is. And shadow ministers supposedly absolutely furious as well. So it's not a given that Keir Starmer is going to ask his MPs to whip them to vote for these restrictions. So the outcome of that vote on Tuesday could be interesting. A
big choice for the Labour leader as well. Nancy Sheffield, can I talk about your area, because you cover Sheffield, Derbyshire, Mansfield, lots of areas in Yorkshire which are in Tier 3 at the moment. And your readers are being told by the government, by the Prime Minister indeed, there's light at the end of the tunnel, sunlit uplands are out there. What's their mood at the moment?
They're furious, they're sad, they're angry, they're frustrated. If you're a pub landlord where you make the bulk of your money in December, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. This is the final straw, isn't it? It's really, really difficult. We've got areas which went in Tier 2 and assumed that they would come out better because the rates have dropped. Sheffield had the worst tier. Then we locked down nationally for 4 weeks and we're going straight back into the worst tier. And it's just really, really difficult for people to contain their frustration. We have had politicians suggest if we changed our name to some random metropolitan borough of London, we might fare better in this great divide.
There's a real sense that you're being unfairly treated because you're too far from Whitehall.
Absolutely. And there's also a sense that our politicians in the north, our MPs and our councils aren't being listened to. I mean, I think that's been quite clear from number 10. Manchester's been punished because they kicked back. Liverpool, which appears to have gone along with it, has been rewarded. And it just, I mean, how can you follow leadership like that? It's a little bit like a school game, isn't it? We don't understand the reasoning. And when we look at the numbers, it doesn't seem to be backed up.
And so from what you're seeing in your letter bags and so forth, would you expect Conservative MPs in your part of the country to rebel over this?
I think they're very likely to. I think they've got this problem, haven't they? They've been elected in areas, only a year ago, not even a year ago, they've been elected in areas that have always been Labour or have been Lib Dem but have not been Conservative. They've been elected around Brexit, which was all about freedom, and we want our freedoms and we want to be able to do what we want to do ourselves without being dictated to, and look where we are now. And the economies are really suffering in the north. It's interesting, there's lots of talk in the paper today about how they persuaded Tier 2 for London because of the jobs at risk. Does nobody care about jobs in the north? That's very much the feedback we're getting today, unfortunately.
So that's one aspect of it, of course, but nobody wants the freedom to catch COVID-19 and then die of it. So I suppose the government does have a very strong argument that this may be the last really tough period we have to get through. What the Prime Minister was saying in all those metaphors, we have to get through the next few weeks because that is when we finally kill this virus off.
Well, absolutely. But this is the Prime Minister who also said he wouldn't go back into national lockdown. I just think it's confidence, isn't it? Nobody wants to get COVID. Everybody wants to deal with it. But I don't think we feel confident that this is the way to deal with it because because we're lacking confidence right at the very top. So it needs more investment locally, and it needs the local leaders to step up and remind people, because you're right, people were terrified. We were all terrified at the beginning, and now people are fed up, and that is really dangerous. Yes,
and of course a lot of those local leaders have signed up to this. Now, we're talking, of course, about the huge economic cost this week of COVID-19. And in the past, I've been very complimentary about the graphics people in the Sunday Times. We're all trying to kind of put these huge figures into context. And there's a spread in the Sunday Times here. The cost of COVID so far, £283,913 million worth. And they're trying to put it into context. Just talk us through what they're telling us.
Yeah, I mean, it's an absolutely staggering figure that I don't think any of us really understand until you break it down. So if you break that down, that's 2 Apollo space missions, that's 15 Channel tunnels, and we all remember how expensive that was. But even on an even better level, for the NHS staff, each, that will be a £200,000 bonus, and it will mean none of us in the entire country would have to pay any tax at all for almost a year. And I think when you break it down like that, you realise the eye-watering amounts that have been spent. And some of it is absolutely necessary. Probably the vast amount of it is absolutely necessary. But there's also lots of stories on this page and involved in this graphic about private hospitals being paid to treat patients that never arrived and things like that. Again, they're big numbers, aren't they?
They're really big numbers. It's always tough in journalism to explain big numbers to ourselves and then to everybody else. Sarah Smith, turning to Scotland again, the Scottish front pages, many of them, are very different to the English front pages because there's been a big announcement by the SNP overnight.
Absolutely, that's right. So our front pages aren't dominated by COVID to the same extent. It's probably worth pointing out, I mean, all these arguments over the 3 tiers in England, which are going to be voted on next week. There are 5 levels of restrictions in Scotland. The highest, level 4, is what's in place here in Glasgow, where I am, and for large parts of the west of Scotland. There's not nearly the same controversy about it here as there is over tier 3 restrictions in England. But anyway, and turning to what's
Northern
actually...
Ireland, we should say. Northern Ireland is going into a circuit breaker lockdown right now.
Absolutely, and the rules are very different in Wales as well, of course. But so it is the SNP's annual conference, although it's being held virtually online this time. But they made a big announcement yesterday. You can see it in the front page of the Scottish Sun, where they say War of Independence, and it's dins because it's referring to school dinners. They say after Bojo made a meal of it, here's the War of the Independents as the Nats top the PM with free school grub vow. So what it is they are promising free breakfasts and lunch to every primary school pupil in Scotland, regardless of your background. But that's a promise which they say will come in if they're re-elected in these really crucial elections for the Scottish Parliament in May. You can see it's the front page of Scotland on Sunday as well. Free lunch, and of course it does include free breakfast. But what's quite interesting about this, and they write about it inside, is it may very well be a popular policy from the SNP, but the Scottish Conservative leader, Douglas Ross, he actually says that he made this a policy back in September. It was a key part of the Scottish Conservative schools policy. He says he's really happy that the SNP have cut and pasted his policy, but why wait until after the next election? Why not just introduce it now?
But good news, Sarah, for the SNP from another direction at the moment, because a fairly prominent in Scotland Scottish Labour figure has switched on independence.
Yes, that's right. On the front of the Sunday Times, we can see that. So this is an academic called Duncan McLennan. He is a professor of public policy at Glasgow University, but also he was a really key special advisor to 3 successive Labour First Ministers, Donald Dewar, Henry McLeish and Jack McConnell. So he's always been very much associated with being a supporter of devolution, but being a unionist. Well, he's come out in favour of independence and says that we need an independence referendum as soon as possible, that it's of fundamental importance. And the argument he makes is that Scotland has been steadily disconnected from English policy debates and from the civil service in Whitehall. And he says there's been a lack of intergovernmental cooperation, highlighting concerns that the UK government's going in the opposite direction. He says muscling in on devolved matters, curtailing the power of the Scottish Parliament. And, of course, he references Boris Johnson calling devolution a disaster, which is something that was reported last week that Boris Johnson has said on a call to some of his MPs. So, I mean, that is part of a trend. We see more and more public figures coming out in favour of independence. But a serious economist like that and somebody who was so close closely associated with the Labour Party. It's going to put a spring in the step of any of those nationalists who are tuning in online to watch their conference this weekend.
Indeed. No prospects at the moment of independence for Yorkshire, Emily, but Emily and Sarah, thank you both very, very much for the paper review. Much appreciated. Now then, I don't know if you know what tier you're going to be in, or if you want to know what restrictions you'll face when lockdown ends next week. You can use the checker on the BBC News website. Just enter your postcode and see what the rules are. And so to the weather. Well, down in the soft south, it's been blandly mild, certainly not unpleasant. I've noticed the leaves coming off the trees earlier than usual. Very bare branches for November. Lots of theories about that. But over to Louise Lear for the real weather. Louise.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, the wind is not blowing the leaves off the trees at the moment because it's very still out there. Unfortunately, that means that it's not lifting this low cloud and misty, murky weather that we've got at the moment. The vast majority seeing a cloudy grey day today. Best of any brightness across the southwest and parts of Wales, also through northeast Scotland, where it was a cold and frosty start here, but at least you hang on to the sunshine. And the cloud may be thick enough at times to produce a little bit of drizzle into the northwest as well. But the temperatures, well, they will stay on the mild side for the time of year. Highs of 8 to 11 degrees quite widely. Now, through the night tonight, we'll see the clouds gathering pace and the rain arrives as we have some wetter weather into the northwest. The winds will strengthen here as well. Now, because of all the cloud around, it is going to stay pretty mild through the night tonight, but it means tomorrow there's some rain to come. Now, that rain will continue to push its way steadily south and east as we go through the afternoon, perhaps not reaching the far southeast until after dark, and even by then it'll be fairly light and patchy. Behind it is a bright and breezy affair into Scotland. Temperatures already starting to cool off as that wind direction changes to a northwesterly, but sea highs of around 10 or 11 degrees. Now, as that weather front continues to push its way steadily south and east, it's going to introduce some cooler air with it as well, particularly in sheltered eastern areas as the northerly wind is set to dominate. So for the start of Tuesday morning, could be cold and frosty across the north and east. The temperatures are starting to come down a little, more unsettled and cooler by the end of the week. Andrew.
Many thanks. Now then, with the crucial vote on the new tier restrictions coming in the Commons on Tuesday, I'm joined by the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy from Salford. Lisa Nandy, welcome. Thanks for that.
Morning.
Good morning. Now, good news really this morning. Infection rates are down. The R rate is below 1. Things are looking up. Are you going to vote for the government's new restrictions, the new tier system, on Tuesday or not?
Well, we very much share the view that there need to be public restrictions. You said it's good news this morning, but I think we're still very concerned, particularly in parts of the north of England like mine, about the pressure on hospitals. So we don't share the view of those Tory backbenchers that you can just let this virus rip through the population with the damage that that would do. But we want clarity from the government on two things. First of all, is this sufficient to get control of the virus? We're meeting the Chief Medical Officer tomorrow afternoon to discuss that. And secondly, whether people will actually be able to comply with this. At the moment, only 11% of people who are asked to self-isolate through the NHS app are actually able to do so, many of them not eligible for one-off payment to help them do that. We need to see proper support put in place so that people can comply. Otherwise, we could end up in a worse situation in January, and nobody wants that.
It sounds as if you're leaning towards voting with the government, but you want more economic help as the price for that. If you don't get that, will you still vote with the government?
Well, look, our support is not unconditional. We will act in the public interest. So we need to know, first of all, that these measures are tough enough in order to get control of the virus. Otherwise, what we're asking businesses to do is go through significant pain, people laid off, some businesses at risk of collapsing, without being able to show that this is worth it, that it will actually set us on a path to recovery in the future.
So I'm sorry to labour this, but if you don't get those assurances, will you try and vote this down or not?
Well, it's not too late for the government to come forward with those assurances, and we're not in favour of rejecting public health measures. Just remember, Andrew, this is a straight up or down vote. It's these measures or no measures, but we want to know that the government is coming forward with that help, and that's the basis on which we would vote for them.
Parsing your answer, it sounds to me very much as if you will definitely vote for these measures. Now, you say the Conservative Party is divided, which it certainly is, but so is your own party. Your colleague Kat Smith says the reality is that Lancashire should have multiple different tiers of restrictions because we're a very diverse county, and we look in different directions. There are a lot of Labour MPs, including members of the Shadow Cabinet, who are very unhappy about this.
I think everyone in the country is quite unhappy at the moment because this has been a very difficult process. I had a briefing with one of the health ministers on Thursday, and there are a lot of Conservative MPs and some Labour MPs who were asking those questions about their own areas. The reason that I'd asked the government to publish the criteria on which these decisions are made is because if people don't feel that these decisions are fair and that all areas of the country are being treated fairly, I don't think people will follow them. Just remember that in parts of the country like mine, people haven't been able to hug members of their family for 4 months now. So if we're going to ask people to do this, we need clarity about that criteria. The government wrote to MPs overnight. I'm not sure Labour MPs have got that letter yet, but I think Conservative MPs might have, to say that they're going to publish that criteria, but it's very, very vague. I mean, one of the measures, for example, is pressure on the NHS. We need far more clarity about what that means. The reason that I'm not committing to vote for these measures is because we're not convinced at the moment that they are either sufficient or workable. It's not too late for the government to convince us of that, but that's what they've got to do in the next 48 hours. They haven't even published the regulations yet, let alone the economic or health impact assessments. They say they're going to do that in the next 24 hours. We want to see them, and we want the government to come forward to make sure that this does actually work and get control of the virus.
But given everything that you've said, can you really bear to vote these measures down, in which case there'll be no restrictions at all and some kind of free-for-all in due course? I put it to you, an awful lot of people look at the Labour Party's position and simply don't believe that in the end you won't be voting with the government.
No, we've never voted against health restrictions. All the way through this virus, it's been absolutely clear that we need health restrictions. Some of the restrictions that we've got now, we need, frankly, because the government wasted the summer. They still haven't got control of test, trace and isolate, and that's where we are where we are. We wish that we weren't. We shouldn't have been here. We repeatedly warned the government about that, but given that we are, we're certainly not going to set our face against health restrictions that are recommended by SAGE and by the scientific advisors. What we want to make sure is that they're actually workable.
If these restrictions go through and cases carry on rising, which is possible, will you vote for another national lockdown? Or do you want another national lockdown in the new year?
No, what we want the government to do is to make sure that the measures that they take this week are actually sufficient to get control of the virus, that people are able to comply with them, and we want them to, crucially, to use time to fix, test, trace and isolate. I was asked to self-isolate a few weeks ago, and having been through the experience myself, I can tell you absolutely that this is not working, that the messages that you get are very confusing. I was given several different dates until which I had to self-isolate. I'm fortunate that I'm not in a position where I stand to lose my job if I don't go into work, but many of my constituents are. It's a very, very difficult thing to do, and I only got a phone call 10 days in to ask if I was in need of any additional support. I mean, this just isn't working.
But these are the very same strict measures that you as a party are calling for.
We're calling for a workable test, trace and isolate system, and one of the reasons that we've said for months now that the government has to take this away from these national contracts and call centres and hand it to public health directors is because public health directors are actually far better at reaching the right number of contacts and working with local authorities to put support in place for people who have to self-isolate. They've had months to do this, they just haven't done it, and if they don't do it now, then what we could see is, with winter flu coming, winter falls coming, we could see ourselves in a much worse situation in January, and nobody wants that. That's why we're saying to the government, you've got 48 hours, please get this right.
Talking about this new tier system, the tougher tier system, Matt Hancock told the Commons that unfortunately, he said, we did see the impact on the number of cases going up and continuing to go up in those areas where local leaders were not working alongside us. And of course, Manchester is still in tier 3 and Liverpool, which works much more closely with the government, is in tier 2. Do you think, candidly, that Andy Burnham let down Manchester?
No, I don't. I think that Matt Hancock clearly has a particular personal problem with Andy Burnham, which at times I felt was quite bizarre, but is not really helpful at all. Local authority leaders and Andy Burnham met regularly with ministers and with scientific advisors to try and get this right for Greater Manchester, but all the way through had said, look, we've had restrictions for a very long time here and we need help. Liverpool got the mass testing pilot, that seems to have had some success as well. We've been asking ministers, will we get additional support here in Greater Manchester so that we can actually make sure that people can comply with this? I think that is the responsible thing to do.
Okay. All right, Lisa and Andy, thanks very much for getting up and joining us this morning. Much appreciated. Now then, something strange happened in the week. The Oxford vaccine team, partnered with the pharmaceutical giant AstraZeneca, announced successful results and then generated a thicket of question marks and a falling share price. It doesn't seem that there was anything wrong with the vaccine, but there have been problems with the way the results were presented. We invited them, of course, to come on this morning and explain all of that, but no. Instead, I'm talking to the man who probably has a better overview on the testing of vaccines than anybody else, Professor Peter Openshaw, Professor of Experimental Medicine at Imperial College London and a government advisor. I asked him if, fundamentally, this was good news.
Yes, that's what we think, based on the press releases. But I think, even more important is that it looks as if several trials are reporting very good efficacy. And that, I think, means for sure that this is a virus that we can defeat by vaccination. We didn't know that. And that's fantastically good news.
Very, very good news overall. But for AstraZeneca, a difficult week. You mentioned the press release. And at the centre of the press release was this figure of 70% efficacy. Was that a real figure?
Well, that was a figure which came about by merging two slightly different studies. So there was the Brazilian study, which was on nearly 9,000 people, and that gave us a control placebo saline injections. Then there was the UK limb of the study, which was nearly 3,000 people, and that gave a meningitis vaccine as control and also monitored the virus levels quite intensively. So they were rather different studies, and they came up with rather different results. And by merging those two studies together, you end up with that sort of middle efficacy rate of just over 70%.
Professor Openshaw, let me ask you about this strange word we've been using, efficacy, and the percentage efficacy rate. It's a piece of jargon, I suppose, or a scientific term, but what does it actually mean for people at home?
Well, I suppose to try and explain it in a straightforward way, if you have a trial underway and you get 100 cases in the placebo limb and only 10 cases in the active limb, then that's a 90% reduction. So the efficacy of the intervention is 90%. 90% is stunningly good. That's a really good efficacy.
So if we're given, for instance, a figure of 70%, does that mean that I, as an individual, if I get that vaccine, have got 70% less chance of getting the disease? Or does it mean the vaccine works with 70% of people?
It means that if you, as an individual, get the vaccine, then instead of having a high chance of being infected, you have only about a third of the chance of becoming infected and having disease. But just to point out that in these studies, there were no cases at all of severe disease in those who were given the active vaccine. Even the infections that were observed in the active vaccine groups were very mild. So I think all of that is very good news. And I think we should assume for the moment that people won't be suffering from long COVID if they've been vaccinated, because the disease will be greatly attenuated and limited in its extent. So that's another probable benefit which we need time to assess.
Let me ask you about this very strange aspect of the results, which is that if you get a half dose and then a month later you get a full dose of this vaccine, you may be 90% protected, not 60% protected. That's a big jump. Does anyone understand why it's happening?
Well, there are a lot of very interesting immunological reasons why it might be. The immune system has got a very difficult balance to make between tolerating something and reacting against it. In studies of vaccination, you can sometimes get this thing called high dose tolerance, where if you give a bigger dose, you actually get a lesser effect. And that's a feature of the immune system, trying to differentiate between something which is dangerous and something which isn't. There's lots of interesting speculations about the immunology of this. It is explicable, but we need more data to try and understand it.
If I'm sitting at home and my doctor rings me up and says, "Good news, Andrew, we can get you a vaccine," at the moment, looking at the results that have come out, I might well say, excellent, can I have the Pfizer one or the Moderna one rather than the AstraZeneca one, because their efficacy rate's much higher?
I would personally be happy to have any vaccine that's been through the regulatory scrutiny that these trials are currently undergoing. If my GP rings me and says, "I've got an approved vaccine," I really don't care which one it is. I do think these RNA vaccines are extremely exciting. They're they seem to have a very clean and very powerful effect. And I think we're all very excited about this as scientists, because it's a real new way of giving a very easily adjusted, easily sort of tailored vaccine, almost a plug-and-play system for vaccinology, which is fantastic.
There's been talk about vaccines being available to people as early as next week. Is that remotely plausible, do you think?
I would be surprised if it's next week, but I know that the regulators are looking very hard, and they're doing everything they can to scrutinise all the data. But my understanding is that there's been quite an interactive process with the regulators whilst these trials have been going on, so they have actually had sight of a lot of the information ahead of time. I wouldn't be too surprised if an announcement would be made within the next 2 weeks, possibly even as early as next week, but we'll have to wait and see. It mustn't be rushed. It has to be safe.
Absolutely. Can I ask you, finally, the Prime Minister's reported today to have told Tory MPs that he hopes restrictions will be lifted later in December, and that there will be a sunset clause on all restrictions that we're living under coming into effect at the beginning of February. Does that, as a scientist, seem to you to be a good thing to be doing or not?
We scientists are very concerned indeed about relaxation of precautions at this stage. The rates are still too high. There's too many cases coming into hospital. There's too many people dying. And if we take the brakes off at this stage, just when the end is in sight, I think we'd be making a huge mistake. We've all sacrificed so much. Everyone has sacrificed enormously in order to get the transmission rate down. With only a few months to go until the vaccines start to have an effect, I think it would just be a terrible mistake. I think we must keep this under control and just behave very, very sensibly. It's extremely difficult to get this right, and I don't envy the politicians.
Professor Openshaw, thank you very much indeed. And let's pick up on that very point. 3 days ago, the Prime Minister did say, if we ease off now, we risk losing control of this virus all over again, casting aside our hard-won gains and forcing us back into a New Year national lockdown. I'm joined by the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Rabb. Mr. Rabb, what's happened? What's changed?
Good morning, Andrew. Look, we want to come out of the national level lockdown and stay out of it. And we have got some good news, as you heard, cautious good news in relation to the vaccine. We hope, subject to the regulatory approvals, to be in a position to be able to have rolled out the vaccine sufficiently by, say, the spring to enable us to have a big change in the way we approach things, life getting back somewhere akin to normal. The two elements to bridge between where we are now to that point. First of all, the tiered restrictions. Yes, we're starting off more strictly than we had done previously when we had the tiered approach, but that's important for the reasons that your previous guest just made. We want to relax from a position of strength with the virus going down, not up. Secondly, community-wide testing at scale, 12 million people already tested. Those two elements help us bridge the gap, save lives, keep livelihoods preserved as best we can, and move to that better place come the spring.
So just while we're talking about vaccines, Professor Openshaw, very, very cautious, but saying possibly the first vaccines coming out as early as next week or in the next fortnight. Can people expect next month to start getting calls from their GPs saying the vaccines are in?
Well, we want to get it done as soon as possible, but as you have noted and your guest said, we need to wait for the regulatory approval. But the idea is to roll out the vaccines. We've secured 355 million doses. The team have done a cracking job on that. We've got Nadhim Zahawi looking about the distribution of it now, the new minister really putting some shoulder behind it. But the crucial thing will be the combination of the most elderly, the most vulnerable, key workers between now and the spring. That's what releases us into a better place and gives us the light at the end of the tunnel.
I'm just going to ask you one more time. When does that process start for individuals?
Sorry if I wasn't clear enough. We're dependent on the regulators giving it the green light. But what I wanted to explain was we've got the 350 million
So you can
doses.
go now when you get the green light?
Once the regulators have given us the green light, once then the distribution is in place and that phased approach. And we would like to be able to do that before Christmas.
Now,
to start doing it.
I talked about the change of tone from the government and indeed the Prime Minister, and it's pretty clear in the letter to Tory MPs. He's talking about restrictions being relaxed in the middle of December and a sunset clause at the beginning of February, and the tone is very, very different. I have to ask you, who is more important? It's a very solemn business, of course, overseeing something like coronavirus. Who is more important to Number 10? Is it Steve Baker or is it Chris Whitty?
What's important to the Prime Minister and the whole government is the welfare of this country,
Yeah,
saving lives and livelihoods. No, but it's a balanced
Which way?
approach. But actually, if you look at what we are saying, we're going to the tiered approach. We want to stay out of lockdown properly, sustainably. So we take the tiered approach. That allows us to have these localised restrictions. Some people are complaining they're too tough, they're too restrictive, but we've heard the arguments in favour of public health for this. Having them at this level allows us to ease off when we're confident we can do so. And there are two, I guess, points. One is the fortnightly review, so we can judge the evidence. So it will be possible for those in, say, the highest level tier to progress down the tiers when it's safe to do so. And secondly, and I think we've listened to MPs about this, colleagues on all sides of the House, having a vote on the regulations in January with them sunsetted in February, if that doesn't pass again, I think is the right combination of accountability and transparency with taking the measures that the public need now.
I hear all of that. I still put it to you that you have changed direction, certainly in terms of tone, as a result of backbench pressure. Michael Gove was really, really explicit and quite scary about what was going to happen to the NHS if we didn't have really tough restrictions going ahead. And now the Prime Minister is saying it's all right, the restrictions may come down in the middle of December. I just put it to you, this is too important a subject to be under horse trading between MPs.
Well, so, Andrew, your horse trading is another person's accountability to Parliament. But the truth is we are concerned. We've got the 5 criteria for which tier you're in and how you progress down the tiers. One of those is pressure on the NHS. We were clear about that from the outset. Michael Gove is right to warn about that. On the other hand, we are listening and we do understand. Colleagues say to me, MPs say to me, we just want to understand that the measures you're taking take into account not just the cost and benefit of tackling the virus, but also the non-COVID health, economic and social implications. We'll publish more analysis on that. And we do take seriously the principle of parliamentary accountability.
If this doesn't work, if this process doesn't work and infection rates start to go back up again, are we facing a third wave in January and February?
Well, there's a risk of that if we don't get the balance right. But so far, the R level is coming down. That's really important. And that's why we're starting with the tiered approach, more restrictive than some people would like than previously. But that allows us to ease up, but only when...
if you don't get the behaviour you want now and through Christmas, we could have another national lockdown early next year.
Well, look, we're doing everything we can to avoid that. And that's why the 5 criteria, if you like, that guide the level of tiers, but also at the review points, are the prevalence of the disease, prevalence with the over 60s.
It could happen. It could happen. And if it had to happen, you would back it. No, I'm just asking you.
Yeah, but you're getting well ahead. I've explained the government's exit strategy from, frankly, the current set of restrictions. We move to localised. We aim for that vaccine being distributed in the spring. And the 2 things that are crucial are a tiered approach from a position of strength and confidence, with areas coming down the level of restrictions once it's safe and responsible to do so, and the community-wide testing. 12 million people already tested. We've seen in Liverpool how that can really be a force for change. They've now come into a lower level tier, and that's great credit to the authorities up there working with the government and, frankly, the forbearance and the stamina of the people in that area. We need to see that nationwide. That's how we get to spring and a much better place.
Brexit. Are we really in the final end game of talks this week?
It always feels like the goalposts are shifting, and that's partly doing negotiations with the EU. I do think that this is a very significant week, the last real major week subject to any further postponement of the goalposts in terms of the timing. We're down to really 2 basic issues, but I think in particular the issue around fisheries, and we need the EU to accept the point of principle that as we come through the transition period, it's a fact of leaving the EU that we take back sovereignty and control over our own coastal, as a coastal state, control over our own waters and our own fisheries.
If you had to guess now, and I'm not going to hold you to this, no one will hold you to it, it's a guess. If you had to guess now whether we will get an agreement or not, what would you say?
Well, I'm not really in the guessing business, Andrew, as much as I know it's your job to try and prize me into that space. What I would say is I think the team have done a fantastic job. It feels to me, if I was going to put it like this, that if the EU understand that point of principle and we have some pragmatism, we can get there. Given that there is actually, along the spectrum of issues, fairly narrow now, ish set of issues that we need to resolve, I think the mutual interest in a deal is very strong.
Well, let's talk about what this all means for the economy. Week after week, I ask people like you what your assessment is of the effect on the British economy of there not being an agreement.
Yes.
And week after week, people like you say, I don't know, pass on to somebody else. But we do now have the OBR set up by the government, and they say a 6% hit on the British economy if we don't get this agreement. Is that a figure you recognise?
Look, I respect the OBR. I think it's quite difficult at the moment because we're facing, as a result of the pandemic, the biggest contraction in over 300 years, the biggest budget deficit, double the budget deficit we saw at the end of the financial crisis. But we've always said that there will be challenges when we leave the transition period. We also see huge opportunities. Frankly, we are now in the last leg of the negotiations. We'd much prefer a deal, better for the UK, better for our European partners, but we're going to make a success of Brexit, come what may.
The Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, another Conservative appointment, says that if we don't get a deal, the economic effects long-term on this country are going to be worse than COVID.
I think the long-term forecasts are notoriously difficult to nail down with any precision, and most forecasters would accept that and therefore caveat what they say, not least because you can't see the longer-term impact of things like trade deals and also the control you have over your own laws and the productivity effects that drives. So there are certainly risks. I wouldn't want to be blithe to those, but there are also huge opportunities, and we go into I want us to see us in a position to go into 2021 with real optimism about the path ahead, and I think we've got every reason to do so.
And looking at these OBR figures, again, one really striking thing is they said that failing to reach an agreement could delay our recovery, that V-shaped recovery we're all hoping for after coronavirus, for a year.
Well, look, we would like a deal. Our EU friends would like I think it's in their interest to get a deal. The impacts on them will be very significant. But what we're not going to do, and you talked about...
And you'd put all of that in jeopardy because of fishing. Everything goes because of fishing. Well, and all those big numbers risk because of fishing.
So I agree with you that we ought to be able to, on both sides, resolve fisheries if you take the context of the wider economic gains and potential downsides of not having a further deal. But we will, in any event, I think there's two things. One, we'll make a success of it under the Australian-style arrangements. Secondly, leaving the transition period and leaving the EU, we ought, as an independent coastal state, to be able to have control of our own waters. Every other country around the world expects that. I don't think that that's an unreasonable thing for us to ask the Europeans to take account of.
Let's talk about the near-at-hand effects. We're only 4 weeks or so away from the end of all of this.
Yes.
And it's very hard to work out quite how much disruption there is going to be on the Northern Irish border, but also on the border with France and England. Michael Gove has talked about there being a period of adjustment, which sounds relatively reassuring for just a few weeks. But if you talk to the Road Haulage Association, they are much bleaker, and they talk about really significant disruption, and they talk about an operational disaster recovery being necessary. Can you level with people and tell them how much disruption on those borders you expect at the end of this year?
So, first of all, if we secure a deal, I think we'll be in a much better place, and that's why our negotiators have worked so hard at it. I pay tribute to Michael Gove and the team who are doing all the contingency planning if we leave on Australia-style rules. Of course, there are various measures, contingency measures we can take, but ultimately the question will come down to, in the absence then of a deal, what the Europeans do. And it's difficult to say with any precision. Will they try and ramp up the political pressure on us? Will they take a reasonable approach?
In a sense, this is whether there's a deal or not a deal. Because if you talk to the people who are on the front line in the Dover ports and around the UK looking at this, they say that the systems are nothing like ready, and this is a political problem which the government is sailing into, and we're going to see huge queues of articulated lorries, huge queues of cars, people waiting for ages to get through those borders. And if that happens, it's going to be the fault of politicians, not of the businesses or the people on the front line.
Well, look, of course, politicians will take the responsibility for what's within our gift, and obviously businesses can plan more or less extensively, but businesses, I think, are doing that. But it's not quite right, by the way, to say it solely depends on whether we get the free trade deal, because even under previous scenarios, there's been both measures on the UK and the EU side and an element of coordination, and that has always included around HGV. So that actually is one area where we ought to, with a bit of common sense, be able to mitigate on both sides. But we're fundamentally focused about trying to get that deal over the line.
All right, Dominic, Rabb, thanks very much indeed for talking to us this morning. Now then, Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister, told her party at its annual conference that Scotland is now on the verge of independence from the rest of the UK. Her handling of coronavirus has been much praised. But should it have been? She joins me now from Glasgow. Nicola Sturgeon, you've talked a lot about the low prevalence in comparison of coronavirus in Scotland and other countries. But when you look at the data, isn't the truth that Scotland has the third worst record in deaths from coronavirus of any country in Europe in the first wave?
The number of deaths in Scotland is far too high. You won't hear me say any different. I don't think there is an acceptable level of deaths. What I would say is, firstly, and you know, I don't think it should be seen as a competition, but you've asked me the question in a comparative sense. We've got a lower death rate, if I can use that term, than England and Wales. There are particular issues in Scotland which will not be unique to Scotland, you know, different demographics, some intergenerational issues of long-term health conditions. But perhaps the most fundamental point, which applies to all countries, is this one. We are still in the teeth of this pandemic. So it's, I think, premature for any country to be declaring victory or assessing performance against others. Every single day right now, my focus is on trying to do the best I can with my Scottish Government colleagues to suppress the virus, to drive levels of the virus down. We're not complacent about that, but we do have a lower prevalence of the virus at the moment than the other nations of the UK. But of course, we've got to work on that every single day. None of us are finding this an easy challenge to face.
Well, you say that, but again, the data doesn't really back you up. If you look at the last 4 weeks in terms of death rates from COVID, that's COVID-19 on the death certificate. And we've looked at the figures from the ONS and the National Records of Scotland. On every week, the Scottish death rate is considerably worse than the English death rate, week after week after week. Week 43, England 16 per million deaths per million, Scotland 19 deaths per million. Week 44, 22 for England, 30 for Scotland. Week 41, 31 for England, 37 for Scotland. And the last week for records, England 40 and Scotland 50. So you have actually done worse than England over the last second wave. Have you let the people of Scotland down?
Well, that's for the people of Scotland to judge. I am working as hard as I can every day. Look, you're inviting me to sort of defend a particular level of deaths, and I'm, obviously I'll address your questions, but I don't think there is any level of deaths that is acceptable. Certainly if you look cumulatively, though, since the start of the pandemic, per million of population, Scotland's death rate, that's a term I hate. However long I'm First Minister, but probably for the rest of my life, I will deeply regret the number of people who've lost their lives in the face of this virus. I have done everything and will continue to do everything I can to try to control the virus, to keep it as low as possible, to take the tough decisions that have to be taken in order to achieve that, and to try to take people of Scotland along in these difficult steps with me as far as I possibly can. But nobody underestimates the pain, the grief, the suffering that this global pandemic has brought to us, and certainly I never will. And I feel, as you can probably tell, deeply uncomfortable at almost a sort of traditional political who's better than somebody else at this. This has been, a tragedy and a trauma for Scotland, for the UK, and indeed for the whole of the planet.
What about people dying in Scottish care homes? Because again, we've gone back to the data, and looking at a report by the University of Stirling, 47% of the deaths in Scotland were in care homes. That's a lot higher than, for instance, in England, where it was 30%. Terrible in both cases. The government down here got a lot of hostility directed at it because of what happened, but your situation was even worse.
Well, you and I have had this discussion before, Andrew. I think we had this discussion in depth the last time I was on the programme. And again, let me preface this by stressing that nothing I am about to say is intended to minimise in any way the tragic toll that coronavirus has taken in our care homes. And you say there has been hostility to the government in the UK. There's been